On this edition of North Bay Bountiful, we explore water conservation and water quality. Northern California experiences periods of drought, but also periods of excessive rainfall, and these rains can often result in flooding. Conserving and managing our use of water is a challenge within this unpredictable environment.
North Bay Bountiful is made possible in part by Rocky, the free-range chicken, and Rosie, the original organic chicken. The Sonoma County Agricultural Preservation and Open Space District. Made Local Magazine and Sonoma County Go Local. And by Pepperwood Preserve. And through the generous support of the Sonoma County Water Agency. Cultivate, celebrate, connect.
Water. It is the source of life. Our use of this resource offers a special challenge to mankind as stewards of the Earth's water supply. Through technology and engineering, we have harnessed the power of nature to supply our own water needs. But with that privilege comes responsibility. John Green is the lead scientist and project manager for the Gold Ridge Resource Conservation District. The district operates in the watersheds that fall to the south of the Russian River, including Dutchbill, Salmon, and Green Valley Creeks, as well as Bodega Bay and Estero Americano. He explains the importance of the hydrological cycle.
Rain falls on the land and eventually either makes its way to a stream or is evaporated or transpired through plants or infiltrates the ground and becomes groundwater. And so most people in Sonoma County, well, it's probably split between surface water sources, which is mainly through the Sonoma County Water Agency, and groundwater, people who have wells.
In order to better conserve the water in Northern California, we first need to understand how the water cycle works and where our drinking water comes from. It is all too easy for us to take our beautiful Sonoma County waterways for granted. But when water comes out of your tap, do you ever think about how it got there?
I'm sad to say that most folks in Sonoma County are not always aware of where their water comes from. It comes from the Russian River. The Russian River is the primary source of drinking water for most of Sonoma County, and it's incumbent upon every one of us to use water wisely. There's never enough to waste.
Our water cycle starts with rain. When rainwater falls, it is collected in streams, rivers, and lakes, like the man-made reservoirs, Lake Mendocino and Lake Sonoma. The larger lower section of Lake Sonoma is water supply, water used for drinking, agriculture, and recreation. The smaller top section of the reservoir is flood control space, an empty area above the water supply that accommodates as much additional water as possible during storms. This reduces flooding downstream of the reservoir.
About 20 miles beyond the hillsides here lies the Pacific Ocean. Moist, warm air is coming towards us in the form of clouds, and as it works its way over the ridge lines, it falls as precipitation, rain. Any rainfall within 300 square miles of this area drains into the lake. All of the sediment that carries winds up in the lake, and the lake acts as a holding area for that. So the water leaving the lake is actually cleaner than the water coming in.
This collected water is released periodically into the Russian River throughout the year to ensure an adequate supply of drinking water and river water for fish. Mike Dillabaugh of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is instrumental in keeping Lake Sonoma and Warm Springs Dam in top condition.
So what you're looking at here is the mouth of the outlet structure, or where the water comes out of the dam in a controlled manner. And so it's basically a 14-foot diameter tunnel back there, and it's going through a series of stilling basins to take the energy from the water. Because remember, the water on the other end is 200 feet under. So there's a lot of energy pushing it out. So we have to slow it down so it doesn't damage anything coming out. From that stilling basin, it then flows through this controlled channel until it gets to a measuring station or the weir, and then from there it flows right into Dry Creek.
If water in Lake Sonoma is being released from the water supply pool, the Sonoma County Water Agency decides how much to release. If water in the reservoir rises into the flood control space, the Army Corps takes control of water release. They let water out of the reservoir until the level returns to the water supply pool. Next, water from the Russian River is diverted to infiltration ponds, where it trickles down into the ground and is naturally filtered by sands and gravels. This natural filtration process means we don't need to add a multitude of chemicals to treat our drinking water. When the filtered water is at the correct depth underground, it is pumped up by collector wells near the river.
So as you can see, down the tube, well over 150 feet, you can see crystal clear water that's naturally produced at Collector 6. This collector well came online in about 2005 or so, mid-2000s, and it's the biggest one. It produces anywhere from 40 million to 80 million gallons per day on average. It's the flagship of sorts.
Next, some chlorine is added for disinfection, and the water is transported through two main aqueducts or pipes to cities in Sonoma County.
Yeah, I think that the general public is really far removed from the pipes.
Yeah, and most people aren't aware that they're there.
Jennifer Burke and Rita Miller, deputy directors for the Santa Rosa Water Department, explain how the department manages and maintains its pipeline system.
The city of Santa Rosa has our own distribution system. We have 59 physical connections between the Sonoma County Water Agency's aqueducts and our over 600 miles of pipelines that provide water to approximately 54,000 customers. We have an asset management team that in essence has an inventory of all of the pipes, storage tanks, valves, etc. that make up our distribution system. They know the type of material, the age, the condition, and they use that information to ensure that we are maintaining the system, that when we need to replace the system, we're replacing those various pipelines and other fixtures. We do things like making sure that we pump up water during times when it's the least costly and least energy intensive, and then using gravity to have that water flow back to homes. So we're always very conscious of the system and the impacts that we have on the environment.
And finally, clean, naturally filtered drinking water arrives at your tap. Once we, as a community, understand just how vital the Russian River is in providing us with drinkable water, we can take action to preserve this precious resource.
The Russian River is a remarkably resilient system, but we need to be mindful of what goes into that system. So, for example, the chemicals that you put on your property when you're in the garden or in the backyard, anything that's left over actually ends up down into our storm drains and goes out into our creeks and rivers. Take care of your medicines. We have a safe medicine disposal program that the county and the cities have launched that's going to make sure that folks do not take expired medications and put them down the toilet. What you have to do is properly dispose of your expired medications at a safe medicine disposal program. Turn the water off when you're brushing your teeth. Put a bucket in the shower when you have that water in the morning and reuse that and put it on plants.
We're here as a resource. We are reaching out to customers, trying to help them, and we're also encouraging customers to consider their water use. And if they have questions or they have ideas that they may be able to use their water more efficiently, use us as a resource.
It's very important that we're mindful of our behavior and how that affects our water supply. I hope that residents of Sonoma County and the North Bay and the North Coast realize how fortunate we are that we have the Russian River as a primary source of drinking water. We can't take that for granted.
Being responsible caretakers of our land, water, and wildlife is essential for our survival. Our collective efforts can begin to repair the interconnected web of which we are all a part. Because what affects our water affects us. Water can only benefit people and wildlife if it is clean. Water free of toxins from industrial waste and agricultural runoff is needed to sustain life in our watersheds. The health of the fish in our rivers and streams is an indicator of water quality, and their access to move freely throughout the waterways is paramount to their life cycle.
Our focus is always on fish because they're especially salmon, because they require a certain range of conditions. To get those conditions, you have to have both a healthy stream, the stream itself, and then a healthy riparian corridor. Having a healthy watershed will provide the creek with sufficient water, sufficient wood, and other types of what we call habitat forming elements. So watershed health is really critical for having a healthy stream and thereby having healthy fish populations.
In Sonoma County, California, many dams are being decommissioned, but those that are still needed to facilitate our water supply are being redesigned so that migrating fish and other aquatic wildlife can move around these man-made barriers. While dams are just one vital step in providing our drinking water, helping us with flood control and water supply, they can cause great environmental impact, blocking fish migrations which are essential to the health of our aquatic ecosystem. Biologist Mariska Obazinski explains why fish are a vital element of our watershed.
Salmon and steelhead populations are indicators of the health of our watersheds. Coho salmon in particular, they live part of their life in freshwater up in the headwater streams, and then they have to migrate out to the ocean through the river systems, through the estuaries, and so they need the environment to be in really good condition in order for them to survive. If we're doing things to help salmon, we're doing things to improve the health of the watersheds, and if we can do that, then we are helping ourselves in the long run. There are a lot of really great projects happening in Sonoma County to improve stream habitat for fish populations.
One of these projects is the new Mirabel fish ladder that was completed last fall. The ladder is part of a water intake facility that includes an inflatable dam. Engineer and project manager of the fish ladder, Steve Koldis, explains why a new ladder was necessary.
When our dam is up and inflated, we fill it with water and we fill it with air. It's about 8 feet tall or so, and there's no way for fish to get around it. And that's why we put fish ladders in the river.
Our original fish ladder was a Denil type fish ladder, and that had these plates in it. These fish would jump up and over these steel plates, and it was amazing that they could do it, but they almost like skimmed just along the top of the water. And these fish are amazing swimmers, but you can imagine not all fish can do that very well. So we looked at different types of fish ladders. What we ended up with was a vertical slot fish ladder, and that allows for all fish to go through without having to jump over any kind of ladder.
This new facility also has a state-of-the-art viewing gallery.
We built the viewing gallery because we have a program where we take school children to our facilities and we educate them about ecosystems and about watersheds, and this just seemed to be a natural thing to add to our facility. I think that people are going to be very impressed when they come to see this site and they see the fish running upstream and seeing the types of fish that are in our river. You'd be amazed at the size of the fish that we get here. We've got a camera on a big window, much bigger than these windows, and we're watching and we're counting and we're classifying all the fish that are going by.
It's important that these fish are able to get around our dam so that they can get to their spawning habitat. It's so integral to our system. So we did this with a lot of intention. We made sure that we were doing a project that would last.
The Warm Springs Fish Hatchery at Lake Sonoma is another project taking the right steps to control our water without harming fish populations. We spoke to Ben White, a biologist with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at the fish hatchery in Lake Sonoma.
When you put a dam up, you're basically blocking potential habitat above the dam, unless you do have some sort of fish ladder to allow the fish to get above the dam. In the case of Warm Springs Dam and this hatchery, there is no passage above the dam. So to mitigate for the loss of habitat and the loss of production upstream of Warm Springs Dam, they've put in a hatchery to basically balance out the effect of losing the spawning habitat and the production upstream of the dam. When the program first started 15 years ago, the number of adults returning to the Russian River watershed was very low. I mean, in terms of 5, 10, 20 fish total. We've seen that number increase to up over 500 adults coming back to the watershed within a 10-year span, which was really a positive thing, and it allowed us to be very optimistic about this program.
The 4-year historic drought definitely took a toll on the program, but biologists say thanks to the normal rain we've experienced this year, they have already seen twice the amount of fish they saw all of last year.
The Coho recovery program is a captive breeding program. So we raise fish from the juvenile life stage to the adult life stage, and then we spawn them here in captivity. So during the spawning season, we go through all of our tanks weekly and we're conducting ripeness sorts. We're essentially looking for fish that are mature and ripe and ready to spawn. The external tag allows for easy identification during the spawning process. We also release some of our adults out into the wild to spawn naturally. So some of the fish are getting selected to be released into Salmon Creek as adults. And that's sort of a low-risk recovery strategy that allows for natural mate selection and allows for these fish to spawn on their own. And then their offspring are wild fish. Coho salmon are an indicator species because of their very rigid life cycle and very specific habitat requirements. So they're sort of a symbol as to the health of our watershed. So when the coho salmon population started to decline, I think it's a wake-up call that we need to make some improvements to how we manage our watersheds and our water as a whole, because it'll not only benefit coho salmon, but it'll benefit all the other species that rely on water. These fish are very amazing creatures. They don't need a whole lot. They're very resilient, and if we can just put a little bit more care and effort into providing and keeping water in our creeks and streams, I think we're going to see a really positive trend over the next few years in terms of recovery with these fish.
We have a limited capacity to capture the water we need during our short-lived winter rainfall periods. Scientists, government, and private citizens are working together to discover ways to collect water when available and manage its use through times of drought and scarcity.
The reservoirs in Sonoma and Mendocino County have to be managed for a couple of different purposes. One is water supply and another is flood control. During the winter, they have to release water, let it go downstream so that they have enough room in the reservoir to capture floodwaters so they don't flood downstream areas. Understanding weather patterns really well helps in that management, because the last thing you want to do is release a lot of water from a reservoir and then not have enough rainfall to replenish it. So the better we can understand rainfall, the better we can understand weather patterns. I think the more efficient we're going to be and more effective we're going to be in our management of water resources.
We have an opportunity to capture more water for our use and that of wildlife in the study of weather patterns called atmospheric rivers. When we can predict the time and amount of rainfall more accurately, we can then plan for optimal collection for future use. Floods and droughts. The West regularly experiences greater fluctuations in its yearly precipitation than any other region in the United States.
The Western U.S. has very unique needs for weather information, and they differ a lot from back east, where hurricanes and tornadoes are key. Out here, it's water.
Scientists believe that impending climate change will exacerbate these already variable weather extremes.
That variability really puts a stress on our water management systems, whether you're talking flood control, water supply, or environmental habitat, etc.
Meteorological phenomena known as atmospheric rivers have a significant impact on the variability of precipitation.
Every year, most people in the West Coast recognize that a big chunk of our rain comes from a few big storms, and we've discovered what we call atmospheric rivers because they're these narrow regions in the atmosphere where it's very moist and the winds are very strong, and those winds push that moisture along as water vapor, much like a river on land pushes water along as liquid. So in one atmospheric river at a given moment, it's transporting on average as much water vapor as 20 times the liquid water from the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico. These are truly rivers of moisture in the atmosphere, and they represent just a few percent of the circumference of the Earth if you add them all up.
Ongoing research into atmospheric rivers could play a pivotal role in the way Northern California prepares for winter storms and manages water supply.
When they hit California or the West Coast, they often last about a day. We might get 6 to 10 in an average year. If we get fewer than that, we end up in drought. If we get more than that, we end up with flood risk.
Since the 1950s, the Russian rivers had several floods, and scientists estimate that 87%, almost 90% of those floods were due to atmospheric river events. As a water manager and a water management agency, atmospheric rivers are very important to understand so that we can respond to them, anticipate them, and be able to develop facilities and operations that can accommodate them, whether we get too few or too many.
Key research on atmospheric rivers is being carried out in the Russian River watershed. The Sonoma County Water Agency and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography collaborate with experts from California's Department of Water Resources, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the United States Geological Survey, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
One of the reasons we're working on the Russian River so much is because it is sort of ground zero for the greatest impact of atmospheric rivers. They get about 50% of their annual water supply comes in maybe 10 atmospheric river events each year. Russian River is really where we can learn a lot.
Satellite imagery combined with airborne reconnaissance aids scientists in monitoring atmospheric rivers as they form over the Pacific. Scientists monitor storms as they make landfall in California at 4 unique atmospheric river observatories. One is located in Bodega Bay.
Every hour they measure precisely the conditions that we need to see in order to decide whether there's an atmospheric river hitting from a very precise perspective. So winds in the atmosphere aloft and moisture aloft, when we measure those accurately, we can determine whether it's an AR or not. Because as these storms form up over the ocean, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how strong they are, what their orientation is, how long they're going to last. By measuring these things precisely at the coast, we can get a little heads up. Is the storm going to be weaker or stronger than expected, or later or earlier?
Scientists are hopeful that emerging forecasting techniques and technology will soon allow water managers to more dynamically adapt to atmospheric rivers.
Working with Sonoma County Water Agency and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, we're looking very carefully at a reservoir on the Russian River in Northern California called Lake Mendocino. It has for many years now suffered from drought, and they have less water in it than is ideal. The way reservoirs operate in many cases, not all, but in many cases in California, is they are kept relatively low in the winter so that they can provide flood control. And if a storm hits and the flood space is filled up a bit in the reservoir because a big storm hit, they then release that water slowly after the storm and get it out of the way so they're ready for the next storm.
It is hoped that studies being conducted at Lake Mendocino as part of the Forecast-Informed Reservoir Operations proposed management strategy could serve as a model for efficient reservoir operating procedures.
We're looking at how we might be able to use forecasting to manage the reservoir levels so that we can improve water supply capacity
for people and also for fishery habitat, while preserving flood control.
We're estimating 10,000 acre-feet of extra water we're going to hypothetically try to save in Lake Mendocino. That's enough water for 20 or 30,000 households for a whole year. If that could be achieved, it would take about 2 days, if there was a storm coming, to release that water safely from the dam, and then another 1 to 3 days for that water to travel out of harm's way past Guerneville, California. So what that means from a weather side is we need 3 to 5 days lead time, confidence that we're not going to get an atmospheric river for the next 3 to 5 days, and that water could safely be retained, we believe. We're still doing the studies. This is all hypothetical. No one's changing any operations based on this. We're just teaming up to think it through.
Advanced forecasting techniques may someday also help mitigate flood risk.
It's possible that if we see a really big storm coming in, we could release water down below the water supply pool, so give up some of that water supply, and then we feel confident that the storm will come in and replenish that water. But because we pre-released some of the water supply, we actually have a much greater flood control protection, because now the reservoir has much more storage to handle the flood waters from the storm, or the runoff from the storm.
Increasing our knowledge of the behavior of atmospheric rivers is essential as we adapt to the effects of climate change.
The models and the forecasts in our region all agree that precipitation is going to become even more variable. So the dries will be drier and the wets will be wetter.
We need to be prepared for both drought and flood. Every year in California, that's the message.
We can make better decisions about how to conserve and protect our water when we are informed about all aspects of our unique hydrological cycle. As individuals, we can certainly make a positive difference, but by working collectively, we can influence public policy and participate as active stewards of the watersheds that sustain our very lives.
When it comes to water, you should slow it, spread it, sink it, and store it. You know, slow it down, don't let it run off, spread it out so it has the opportunity to sink into the ground. Put it into a storage tank so you have a water supply during the summer, but reduce the amount that goes downstream.